The townsfolk whispered before she even showed. Maybelle Carter, the banker's daughter, soft-spoken, soft-bodied, and now carrying a secret. Her father's shame burned hotter than the summer Sunday. "No man will have you now," he spat. So when a stranger rode into town, a giant of a cowboy named Bo Rollins, broad as an ox and quiet as dusk, the banker saw his chance. He offered him land, a horse, and gold, if he'd take the girl. Bo looked at her, cheeks flushed, eyes downcast, and said only, "I don't buy people." But when Maybelle's father shoved her toward him and said, "Then take her as pity," Bo caught her before she fell and said, "No, sir, I'll take her as my wife." Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The church was hot that afternoon, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and tempers burn quicker than kerosene. Maybelle Carter stood at the altar in a faded blue dress that once belonged to her mother, her trembling hands clutching wilted daisies. Her father sat in the back pew, jaw tight, eyes colder than the coins he hoarded in his bank vault. The preacher's voice droned low and slow, but every word seemed to echo through her bones. "Do you take this man?" Bo Rollins stood beside her like a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and silent, his hat respectfully in hand. He didn't flinch beneath the whispers or the snickers that drifted through the pews. Folks had turned out just to see it, the banker's disgraced daughter tied to the wandering giant who'd never bowed to anyone. Bo didn't smile, didn't nod to the crowd, didn't even look her father's way. He just said, "Let's get it done." And when the preacher told him to speak his vows, he simply answered, "I will." His voice was steady, deep, and sure, the kind of voice that made even the cruelest tongues quiet down. Maybelle's lips trembled as she repeated the words, her throat dry as dust. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the air seemed to still, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. Then Bo reached for her hand, not roughly, not out of duty, but gently, like he understood she'd been handled too hard already. He led her out past the murmuring crowd, down the steps, and to his waiting wagon, where a single horse waited under the sweltering Sunday. Her father didn't follow. He just muttered something sharp and cruel that she couldn't bear to hear. The wheels creaked as Bo flicked the reins, and the two of them rolled away from the church, dust rising behind them like a veil. Folks leaned out of doorways, whispering, "There goes the giant and the banker's mistake." Maybelle kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, cheeks burning, heart pounding so loud she could hardly breathe. Bo didn't look at her, didn't speak, but his silence wasn't cruel, it was patient, like he knew words would only make things worse for now. The road stretched endless before them, the land raw and open, nothing but sky and dry earth and the faint promise of rain. After miles of quiet, she found her voice and whispered, "I'm sorry you had to do this." Bo glanced her way, the corner of his mouth twitching under the shadow of his beard. "No one made me," he said simply. That was all, and somehow, it was enough. She turned away before he could see her tears. As the sun dipped low, they passed the last fence line marking the town's edge, and the world seemed to widen. No gossip, no father, no eyes watching her every move. Just the creak of the wagon and the slow, steady breathing of the man beside her. In that vast silence, something inside her shifted, small but real, a tiny seed of peace that dared to take root in the dust of her shame. The wagon rolled through the dying light until the land turned rough and wild, the kind of country that didn't care who you were before you came, only who you became once you stayed. Maybelle sat stiffly beside Bo, her hands clutching the hem of her dress as the wheels jolted over stones and roots. The town had long vanished behind them, swallowed by the hills, and ahead rose the shape of a lonely cabin against the blood-red horizon, a squat, wind-beaten thing that looked as if it had grown right out of the earth. Bo stopped the wagon and climbed down without a word, his boots thudding into the dry ground. He moved with quiet purpose, unhooking the horse, checking the reins, his massive frame moving with a kind of careful grace that surprised her. "Ain't much," he said finally, looking up at the cabin, "but it's solid. Keeps the rain off." Maybelle nodded, unsure what else to say. Her throat still ached from holding back tears all day. Bo opened the door for her, ducking slightly under the low frame, and inside she found a single room, rough-hewn walls, a potbelly stove, a small bed in the corner, and a table with two mismatched chairs. It smelled of smoke and pine and something faintly metallic, like tools left out in the rain. She hovered near the doorway until Bo lit the lamp, the soft glow revealing dust motes hanging in the air like tiny ghosts. "You can take the bed," he said, tossing his hat onto a peg. "I'll use the floor." She turned to protest, but he was already stacking kindling by the stove, his movements calm, deliberate. When he struck the match, the flare of light caught his face, strong lines, steady eyes, the look of a man who'd learned patience from hardship. She wanted to ask him why he'd said yes, why he'd chosen to marry a girl the whole town had laughed at, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she folded her hands in front of her and whispered, "Thank you." Bo didn't look up. "Ain't nothing to thank me for," he said softly. "Just get some rest." She sat on the edge of the bed, the blanket coarse beneath her fingers, watching as he stretched out on the floor near the fire. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, and an owl called from somewhere in the dark. The silence pressed heavy, but it wasn't the cruel silence she'd known at her father's house. This one was different, almost kind. She lay down and turned her face toward the wall, feeling the baby shift inside her, a small reminder of everything she carried: her shame, her hope, her fragile beginning. She closed her eyes, waiting for the ache of loneliness to come, but instead she heard Bo's steady breathing, slow and sure, grounding her like the rhythm of a distant drum. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid to sleep. The fire cracked softly, shadows dancing across the walls, and in that dim light, the two of them, the fallen banker's daughter and the quiet giant, began the slow, wordless work of building a life from nothing but silence and second chances. Morning broke pale and cold, sunlight bleeding slow over the hills as a thin fog crawled up from the creek bed below. And Maybelle woke to the crackle of a fire and the smell of coffee, bitter, burnt, but warm. Bo was already outside, his shadow moving across the yard as he split wood with a clean, practiced swing, the sound echoing sharp through the quiet. She rose from the bed and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, stepping out into the chill where the air bit fresh against her skin. Bo looked up, nodded once, then went right back to work. "Water's by the well," he said, voice deep and calm. "You'll want to haul some before the sun gets high." She followed his gesture to a half-broken bucket and a hand pump that creaked like an old mule. It took her 10 tries to bring up a full pail, her arms aching, her breath short. But Bo didn't offer to take over. When she finally managed, he just gave a small nod, not praise, not mockery, as if to say, "You did it yourself." The day stretched long after that. Bo showed her how to gather kindling, how to check the traps he'd set along the ridge, and how to stir the beans without burning the bottom. Her first attempt ended in black smoke and a smell that made her gag, and she nearly cried from embarrassment, her hands shaking as she tried to scrape the pot clean. But Bo only chuckled, a deep rumble that rolled from his chest like distant thunder. "Ain't no one born knowing everything," he said, pouring out the charred mess and filling the pot again. "You'll learn." And she did, slow but steady. By noon, her dress was damp with sweat, her hair stuck to her neck. But there was a spark in her she hadn't felt in months, something alive, something proud. She watched Bo mend a fence post, the muscles in his arms moving like ropes beneath his skin, and wondered if he ever got lonely before she came along. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always worth listening to, simple words that carried weight. At dusk, they sat outside the cabin eating what she'd managed to cook, beans that were at least edible this time, and bread hard as stone. Bo ate without complaint, finishing every bite, then said, "Not bad." She laughed, startled by the sound of it coming from her own throat, and he looked at her with something that might have been surprise, or maybe quiet pleasure. The wind picked up then, tugging at the grass, and she felt the baby stir again, a gentle flutter beneath her ribs. For the first time, it didn't feel like a punishment. The sky turned violet and gold, and she thought maybe, just maybe, she could learn to belong here. When the coyotes started to sing from the ridge, Bo rose and checked the shutters. "Storm coming tomorrow," he said. "Best sleep while you can." She nodded, climbing into bed as he settled by the fire, and as she drifted off to the sound of rain beginning to fall, Maybelle thought that even a hard life could be a good one. if it was lived beside someone who saw you as worth saving. Night settled over the plains like a heavy quilt, the stars sharp and cold above the cabin roof, and inside, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of Maybelle's needle as she mended one of Beau's torn shirts. The days had been long and hard, the kind that left her bones aching but her mind quiet for the first time in years. Beau had gone out at dusk to check the fence line, and when he came back, his shoulders were dusted with frost, his hair damp from the mist. He hung his coat by the door and nodded at her work. "Didn't think that shirt could be saved," he said, and when she smiled shyly, he added, "Guess I was wrong." They ate supper in silence beans again, and the last of the cornbread she'd managed not to burn until finally, after the plates were cleared and the lamp turned low, Maybelle spoke. Her voice was small at first, hesitant, like she was afraid the words might break if she let them go. "Beau," she said, "you ever make a mistake that won't stop following you?" He didn't answer right away, just stared into the fire, the light carving deep shadows across his face. "I've made plenty," he said at last. "Question is whether you keep running from 'em or you stop long enough to turn around." She took a shaky breath, fingers twisting in her lap. "There was a man," she began, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. "He came through town last spring, said he was heading west, looking for land. He said he'd marry me when he got back. Said I was pretty in my own way." Her throat tightened, but she pushed through, voice trembling. "I believed him. And then one morning he was just gone. No note, no word. Just gone. When Pa found out, he said I'd shamed him, said no decent man would ever want me again." The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke her. Beau didn't speak, didn't move, just let the fire pop and hiss between them. She dared a glance up, expecting judgment, but his eyes were steady, calm, the same way they always were when he was fixing something broken. "That ain't your shame, Miss Maybelle," he said quietly. "That's his." She blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "But everyone—" He shook his head. "Everyone ain't worth listening to. That man made a promise and ran. You carried the weight for both of you. And that ain't fair." His words landed soft but solid, like stones set in place. For a long time she just sat there, watching the flames dance, feeling something she hadn't felt since before the baby, a strange, cautious kind of peace. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and wild sage through the cracks in the door. Beau stood, adjusting the fire, and when he spoke again, his voice was rougher, almost tender. "You ain't alone anymore, Maybelle. You hear?" She nodded, tears blurring her vision, and when she finally lay down that night, the fire's glow warm against her cheek, she realized her shame had lost its teeth. It was still there, somewhere deep, but it no longer owned her. Not out here, not with him. The wind carried the scent of dust that morning, dry and sharp, as Maybelle hung Beau's shirts on the line and watched the horizon blur into gold. The prairie stretched endless, quiet but for the buzz of flies and the far-off creak of the windmill turning slow. She'd grown used to the rhythm of their days, the small comforts of the fire's crackle, Beau's steady footsteps, the warmth of the baby moving inside her. But there were still mornings when her father's words echoed through her head like a whip crack. "No man will have you now." She tried to shake it off, focusing on the simple work before her. But when she looked up, she saw a cloud of dust rising fast along the trail, and her heart stuttered. Beau stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes narrowing against the Sunday. "Rider comin'," he said, voice flat. The figure took shape slow, a horse, a black coat, a familiar slouch in the saddle. Maybelle froze, the air leaving her lungs. Her father. He pulled up near the fence, boots gleaming, face red from the ride, but his smile was mean and thin. "Well," he called out, "look at you. Thought I'd see how my daughter was faring in her new arrangements." His tone made the words sound filthy. Beau didn't move closer, just stood between them, tall and unshakable. "You've checked," he said evenly. "Now you can turn back." The banker laughed, swinging down from his horse. "Don't get high and mighty, Rollins. You think I don't know what you're after? My money bought you this wife." Beau's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed calm. "Your money didn't buy a thing. You gave her away like a sack of grain. I just happened to be the man standing close enough to catch her." The words hit hard, and Maybelle saw her father's face darken. He spat in the dirt, eyes cutting toward her belly. "You look the part now," he sneered. "A ranch wife in rags. Tell me, girl, was it worth it? Trading a fine house for this shack and a bastard child?" Maybelle's throat burned, but before she could speak, Bo stepped forward, slow and steady, until his shadow fell over the older man. "That's enough," he said, voice low as thunder. "You've done enough harm for one lifetime. Ride home." The banker laughed again, but there was no strength in it this time. He looked up at Bo, truly looked, and for the first time seemed to see how small he was. His bluster faltered. "You'll regret taking her," he muttered, climbing back into the saddle. "She's a burden you can't carry forever." Bo's gaze didn't waver. "Then it's a good thing I was built to carry heavy things." The man scowled, tugged the reins, and turned his horse back down the trail, dust rising behind him until he vanished into the horizon. Maybelle stood silent, shaking, until Bo's hand found her shoulder. "Don't let him back in your head," he said gently. "He's just noise." She turned to him, eyes wet but fierce, and whispered, "He's still my father." Bo nodded. "Maybe. But blood don't always make kin." The wind rose then, bending the grass low, and she leaned against him, feeling the solid strength that had already become her shelter. Somewhere deep inside, the child kicked, not from fear this time, but from something stronger, something that felt almost like defiance. The storm rolled in like a living thing, black clouds crawling over the horizon and swallowing the last light of day, the wind rising until it howled through the eaves of the cabin like a wild animal. Bo had seen storms before, but not one like this, the kind that rattled the windows and made the earth tremble underfoot. He moved quick, pulling in the livestock, tying down what he could, shouting over the roar of thunder for Maybelle to stay inside. But when he came back through the door, soaked to the bone, he found her doubled over near the table, her hands clutching her swollen belly, face pale as snow. "Bo," she gasped, her voice a thin thread against the wind. "It's time." For a heartbeat, he just stood there, frozen, the world narrowing to the sound of her pain. Then instinct took over. He shut the door, threw more wood on the fire, grabbed clean rags and water, anything he could find. "I don't know what I'm doing," he muttered under his breath, but she only shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Just stay," she whispered, and he did. Hours passed in a blur of screams and thunder and prayer. He held her hand when she thought she couldn't go on, wiped the sweat from her brow, whispered the only words he could find, rough, clumsy things meant to keep her here, breathing, fighting. The rain hammered the roof, lightning split the sky, and still she pushed, crying out until her voice broke. When she faltered, he said her name like it was an anchor. "Maybelle, stay with me. You're the strongest person I ever met." And she did. With one final cry, raw and fierce, the child came into the world, a small, slippery bundle that screamed louder than the storm itself. Bo stared at her in awe, hardly daring to move until Maybelle sobbed. "Is she?" He looked down at the tiny face, red and perfect, and something in him cracked open. "She's perfect," he said softly, his voice shaking for the first time. He wrapped the baby in his shirt, the only thing clean enough, and carried her to Maybelle's arms. The wind outside began to die, the thunder fading to a far-off murmur, as if the world itself had quieted to listen to that first cry. Bo knelt beside them, watching Maybelle hold the baby close, her eyes glassy with exhaustion and wonder. "You did it," he whispered. She smiled faintly, her hand finding his. "We did." The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world washed clean, the air smelling of rain and wild sage. Bo stepped outside just long enough to see the sun break through the clouds, painting the wet earth in gold. When he came back in, Maybelle was asleep, the baby nestled against her chest, tiny fingers curled like a promise. He stood there for a long time, hat in hand, feeling something he didn't have a name for, something deeper than pride, softer than joy. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was love. He sat beside them, letting the fire warm his cold hands, and whispered to the little girl, "Welcome home, Lila. You got the whole world waiting on you." The wind outside sighed through the grass, gentle now, and Bo knew he'd remember that night for the rest of his life, the storm that broke the land and gave him a family all in the same breath. 2 weeks later, when the baby was strong enough to travel and Maybelle could stand without gripping the doorframe, Bo hitched the wagon and told her they'd go to town for supplies. The morning was bright but cold, the kind of chill that cuts straight through you, and though the prairie glowed green from the rain, Maybelle's stomach twisted with dread as they neared the cluster of buildings she'd once called home. She hadn't been back since the wedding, since the whispers and the shame and the eyes that followed her every step, and now she carried her child close to her chest, wrapped tight in a quilt she'd stitched by hand. Bo rode silent beside her, one hand steady on the reins, the other resting casually on his thigh, but his jaw was set firm, his gaze hard as he scanned the road ahead. When they reached Main Street, the sound of the wagon wheels over dirt seemed louder than it ought to be. People stopped what they were doing. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. The women outside the general store fell quiet. A drunk on the saloon porch laughed low and mean. "Well, I'll be," someone said. The banker's mistake come back for a visit. Maybelle's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes down, focusing on the small bundle in her arms. Bo climbed down first, tied the horse, and turned to help her, his hand large and gentle against hers. "Keep your chin up," he murmured. "Ain't no one here worth bowing to." Inside the store, the whispers followed them like gnats. The shopkeeper's wife gave Maybelle a tight smile, her gaze lingering too long on the baby. "How you managing out there, dear?" she asked sweetly. "Can't be easy with all that responsibility." Maybelle forced a nod, biting her tongue. But before she could answer, the door swung open, and a familiar voice drawled, "Responsibility. More like charity." A man stumbled in, one of the ranch hands who used to drink with her father, his breath thick with whiskey. "Bo Rollins," he slurred. "Didn't figure you for the kind to raise another man's get." The store went still. Maybelle froze, her heart pounding in her ears. Bo turned slow, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "That's my wife," he said evenly. "And that's our child." The drunk smirked, taking a step closer. "Ain't what I heard." He didn't finish. Bo's fist landed square in his jaw, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The man crumpled like a sack of grain, the crowd gasping as dust rose around him. Bo didn't raise his voice, didn't look around for approval. He just bent, picked up the sack of flour Maybelle had dropped, and said to the shopkeeper, "Put it on my tab." Then he walked out, calm as a man crossing a field, while the rest of the town watched in stunned silence. Maybelle followed, trembling but strangely light, the baby still sleeping peacefully against her. Once they were back, in the wagon, Bo climbed up beside her and flicked the reins. "Sorry," he muttered, glancing her way. "Shouldn't have lost my temper." She shook her head, a small, brave smile touching her lips. "No," she said softly. "You didn't lose it. You used it." The road stretched wide before them again, the town shrinking behind them, and for the first time since her fall from grace, Maybelle didn't feel small beneath the weight of other people's judgment. She felt seen, claimed, and unashamed. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm so steady and tender it hardly felt real. The three of them bound by the quiet work of surviving and the fragile joy of belonging. Dawn came early on the plains, the light spilling soft over the hills, and Bo would rise first to split wood or check the cattle, his silhouette cutting through the morning haze like something carved from stone. Maybelle would wake next, baby Lila cooing beside her, and she'd start the fire, her fingers deft now, her movements sure. Gone were the trembling hands that burned beans and dropped dishes. She'd grown stronger, her shoulders broader from hauling water, her cheeks full again from the bread she'd learned to bake just right. When Bo came in for breakfast, he'd pause sometimes at the doorway, hat in hand, watching her hum to the baby as she stirred the pot, his face unreadable but his eyes softer than any words he could have offered. They ate in companionable silence, the kind built not on distance but trust, the baby gurgling between them as though she'd been born knowing their love was the glue that held this small world together. That afternoon, Bo built a cradle out of scrap pine thick, sturdy pieces smoothed by his calloused hands, and carved a tiny heart into the headboard. When he brought it inside, Maybelle pressed her fingers to the carving, tears shining in her eyes. "She'll sleep safe in that," she whispered. "Safer than I ever did. Bo just nodded, setting it by the bed. "Ain't much," he said, "but it'll hold." Lila grew fast, her cries strong, her tiny fists always reaching. Bo, who had once looked awkward even holding a plate, now cradled her as if she were made of glass. He'd talk to her in low murmurs while mending a harness or cleaning his rifle, and though she couldn't understand, she'd listen, eyes wide and calm, as though she already trusted him completely. At night, after the chores were done and the baby asleep, Maybelle and Bo would sit by the fire, the silence between them warm and easy. One evening, as the flames danced low, she said quietly, "I used to think being loved meant being perfect or at least pretending to be." Bo looked over at her, one eyebrow raised. "Ain't no such thing as perfect," he said. "Just people trying their best not to break each other." She smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Then I reckon we're doing all right." He chuckled, a rare sound that filled the room like sunlight. "Better than all right," he said. The baby stirred then, and Maybelle went to her, tucking the blanket around her small form. When she turned back, Bo was still watching, that same quiet wonder in his eyes. "You saved me, Maybelle," he said softly. She frowned, confused. "Me? How?" He poked at the fire, the embers sparking gold. "Before you, this place was just a patch of dirt and a man waiting to turn to dust. Now it's a home." Her throat tightened, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. She crossed the room, placed her hand over his, and for a long moment they just sat there, the sound of the wind outside blending with the crackle of the fire. Two souls who'd been broken in different ways, finding that, together, they finally fit. Winter came cruel and lean that year, sweeping across the plains with a hunger that bit through bone and pride alike, and word of the banker's downfall reached them not through gossip but through the emptiness that followed silence. Bo heard it first from the trader who rode out once a month with flour and mail, said the Carter Bank had folded, the doors boarded. The man himself near broke from gambling debts and bad loans. Maybelle said nothing at first, just stood by the hearth holding Lila close, her heart a tangle of sorrow and disbelief. She hadn't seen her father since the day he'd spat in the dirt outside their cabin, but now, picturing him humbled and alone, she felt something twist deep inside, not triumph, not pity exactly, but something softer, stranger. That night, as the snow came down hard enough to drown the world, they heard the faint echo of hooves in the distance. Bo was the first to the door, rifle in hand, the wind whipping his coat as he stepped into the cold. A figure slumped from a horse barely standing, coat torn, eyes wild with exhaustion. Bo caught him before he fell, and in the flicker of lamplight, Maybelle saw the impossible. Her father, older somehow, smaller, the arrogance gone from his face, replaced by a hollow kind of fear. "Pa?" she breathed, the word tasting foreign after all these months. He looked at her, his lips cracked, his voice a rasp. "Maybelle, I got nowhere else." Bo didn't speak, just helped him inside, eased him near the fire, and poured coffee into his shaking hands. The banker's eyes darted around the cabin, the sturdy furniture, the warmth, the cradle beside the bed, and Maybelle saw shame flicker across his face. "You livin' better than I am," he muttered, half to himself. "Never thought I'd see the day." For a long time no one spoke. The fire hissed, the storm moaned against the shutters. Then Maybelle knelt beside him, her voice low but steady. "You can stay the night," she said. "No more than that." He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Later, when he slept, Bo sat by the window, watching the snow pile against the door. "You sure about letting him in?" he asked quietly. Maybelle rocked Lila in her arms, her gaze distant. "He's still my father," she said after a moment. "But he's just a man now. I see that clear." Bo nodded, the firelight soft on his face. "Reckon that's the cruelest mercy of all." In the gray light of dawn, her father woke, his pride stripped down to bone. Before he left, he turned to her, eyes rimmed red, voice barely more than a whisper. "I was wrong, girl," he said. "You made a life out here. A good one." She didn't answer, only held his gaze until he looked away, then pressed a small loaf of bread into his hands. "Take it," she said. "You'll need it." He rode off without looking back, swallowed by the pale horizon, and when he was gone, Maybelle stood in the doorway, snow swirling around her, feeling something break and mend in the same breath. Inside, Bo reached for her hand. "You did right," he murmured. And for the first time in her life, she believed it. Years passed like wind over wheat, each season carving its mark into the land and the people who called it home. And in time, the Rollins Ranch became more than just a patch of earth. It became a story the plains themselves seemed to remember. Bo built more fences, more barns, a windmill that caught the sun like a silver prayer, and Maybelle filled the house with warmth no gold could buy. Lila grew sturdy and wild, chasing chickens and laughter in equal measure, her father's steady calm and her mother's fire alive in every step. The townsfolk who once whispered behind hands now waved when they rode in. The same mouths that had spat cruel words now asking after her bread, her kindness, her counsel. Folks said the banker's daughter had turned her shame into strength, and the giant cowboy into something close to legend. Every year, when spring melted the last of the frost, Bo would hitch the wagon and take Maybelle and the children, two more now, boys with eyes like dawn, into town for supplies. People still stared, but it wasn't mockery anymore. It was wonder. Maybelle, once soft and uncertain, had grown into herself fully, her voice warm and sure, her smile the kind that could calm a storm. And Bo, though time had lined his face and silvered his hair, still moved with the same steady grace, the same quiet that made men listen and women soften. When someone new in town asked about them, the old-timers would lean back in their chairs and tell the story. How the banker's shame became a love that built a home from dust. How a man too big for most rooms found his peace in one small cabin. How a woman the world tried to break became its beating heart. They said Bo's laugh could carry across the valley, rolling low and easy, and that Maybelle's bread could make even the coldest soul feel welcome. On Sunday afternoons, she'd sit on the porch with Lila, teaching her to stitch, while Bo whittled small toys for the boys, his knife moving slow as the sun sank low. Sometimes, when the wind blew right, you could hear him hum an old tune, something without words, something that sounded like the land itself breathing. When the banker died, alone in a distant town, Maybelle sent a small bouquet of wildflowers. Nothing more. She didn't go to the burial, but that night she stood at the edge of their field, the horizon painted orange, and whispered a prayer not for forgiveness, but for peace. Bo came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked. "I am," she said, and she meant it. The wind swept through the tall grass, soft and endless, carrying the smell of rain and life and memory. Years later, when folks told stories around campfires, they spoke of the Rollins place, of how love had taken root where shame once grew, how kindness had outlasted cruelty, and how a giant and a fallen girl taught the world a quiet truth, that redemption doesn't come roaring, like thunder, but softly, like dawn light over the plains. And whenever someone dared speak ill of her past, Bo would just smile that slow, easy smile and say, "Funny thing about shame, it can't live where love's already moved in."